Resources for survivors of violence are really limited, and they are shared among multiple counties.
A lot of us have been denied that access to nature.
It really is a big picture idea here.
What does a garden have to do with sexual violence prevention? Community green spaces like parks, gardens, and labyrinths are directly tied to community health and well-being. They improve our access to healthy foods, activities, and chances to connect with our neighbors and peers. But how can greenery impact how we treat each other? How can the seeds we plant in our community gardens continue to grow in our homes, our families, and our children's lives? In the past few years, a growing number of people in the anti-violence movement have been exploring the connection between green spaces and rates of sexual violence. They're discovering what indigenous communities and grassroots organizers have known for a long time, that gardens have the power to do more than just feed us. When done right, with intentionality and partnership with communities, a garden can heal, it can teach, and it can transform. But a garden itself is just a garden. It's the people and the care behind it that transforms. For this episode of Prevent Connect, I'm sitting down with the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence and their local partners, the Hope Shores Alliance, to talk about their brand new initiative to introduce community gardens to rural northern Michigan. How gardens are bringing people together to prevent violence, and Michigan's dreams for where their gardens can grow. Coming up on this episode of Prevent Connect. Hi, oh my gosh, I am so excited to be joined by Sarah, Andrew, and Paige, my incredible guests all the way from Michigan today. Paige, Aaliyah, and Andrew Bach from Hope Shores Alliance, and Sarah Carter from the Michigan Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Welcome, Sarah, Andrew, Paige. Hi, how are you?
Thanks so much for having us. Doing well on this end.
Yes, thank you so much. Doing well.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So excited to have you, especially on the heels of our Greening and Growing Web Conference. I'm really excited to kind of hear about green spaces and sexual violence prevention and what that actually looks like for local programs. Also, a really exciting note for our audio listeners. This is our first episode of season 4 of Prevent Connect, and we're making some accessibility changes that we're really excited about. So in addition to our audio podcast that we host, we're also going to start cross-posting to YouTube. And we have done that before, but what's different now is that if you're listening to all of us and you want to see Sarah, Paige, Andrew, and I, you want to see our faces, reactions, and kind of most importantly, check out the live captioning so you can follow along. You can find that on YouTube. It's also going to be at preventconnect.org. So this is my first video podcast. So thank you, Andrew, Paige, and Sarah, for kind of being my guinea pigs. I appreciate you.
You know, I don't think I realized this was your first video podcast. That's really exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, I say that now. We'll see how easy this is when I actually go in to edit it. But right now we're feeling very optimistic about it. You know, there are a lot of things that make this podcast episode really exciting for me. One of those is that we get to have a conversation with both the coalition and the local partner. So for people who are not familiar with how it kind of works in the sexual violence prevention space, you have like federal funders, like the CDC, who helps to fund Prevent Connect. We're really grateful for them. And then you have state coalitions and health departments that then get that money. And then those state coalitions and health departments then pick local programs to implement the project. So there are like a lot of different levels where projects can kind of break down. But I know for you all in Michigan, you work really closely at the coalition and at the local program to make this stuff work. You also have talked a little bit about greening. We're here to talk about greening today. And for people who don't know what greening is, especially when it comes to sexual violence prevention, It's really just referencing the connection between green spaces and safer communities, which is kind of a novel concept when it comes to sexual violence prevention, because when we think about consent and sexual violence, we think about healthy relationships education. We think about bystander intervention. We think about social norms change campaigns. So when you start talking about trees and gardens, my first thought, I'm a nature person, and I still was like, I don't get it. So let's kind of start like high level. Can you tell me a little bit about the connection as you understand it between green spaces and safer communities?
So green spaces in communities are what we know as third spaces. So this can be represented by our libraries, our parks, and now the addition of green spaces. And green spaces specifically can foster self-empowerment through community involvement. And when you have a green space, you're connecting to nature in a free way. You're not paying to be there. So this can be accessible to all populations of our community, especially if we have it in town for those without cars or those who are not able to really get out into the wilderness out here.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Paige. And, we're going to come back to that rural piece of it too. We recently hosted a web conference that's available at preventconnect.org, and Joseph from the Michigan Coalition was sharing, and I thought this was such a poignant and really funny thing. He was sharing, when we talk about green spaces and sexual violence prevention, it's not like we're planting trees and then trees are going to swat away a perpetrator. That's not how it works. It's not just green spaces exist, so sexual violence doesn't happen. When we think about why sexual violence exists in the first place, we think about those key factors like food insecurity, housing insecurity, economic disparities, racism, and sexism. We have to think about how we can address those bigger factors. And green spaces, community gardens, and that community connection piece that you just shared about is such an important piece that touches on all of those things. Part of Prevent Connect and why we exist is to highlight really innovative and new strategies to prevent sexual violence and create healthier communities. And I think greening is a perfect example of one of those strategies. I very rarely chat with people and they understand immediately. And I have to kind of remind them, well, we don't have the evidence behind it yet. We have a growing amount of evidence, but what we're doing right now is building that evidence base. And you all are a part of that, which is really, really exciting. You're some of the first people who are doing this work. And Sarah, this project wouldn't be possible without the excitement of the coalition. And I know that you all were a huge part of why this even got started. So I know that you really drove the push to incorporate greening into Michigan's violence prevention work. What made you all, as a state coalition, want to explore the connection between green spaces and sexual violence?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity. I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, I'm an intern with the prevention team. So I've just been jumping into this as the first year of this grant cycle. And previously, the coalition did a lot of work at the state level. And we were really curious about what it would look like at a rural, much more community-based and local level, being those sort of steward leaders and creating these mutual relationships with local organizations that have a much keener eye on what's really going on where they're at. Being able to provide the support, the resources for Hope Shores has been really awesome. And personally, I have been really interested in the same way that Paige has within just environmental justice, food sovereignty, which is allowing people to grow their own food, know where their food comes from. And as a survivor myself, I have gardened for many years. And the healing effects, not only the prevention side, but the healing effects of being connected with the land, seeing how the bugs interact with the plants and the cycles of the weather. And it reminds you, like, I am nature as well. I did a lot of research in this sort of the spirituality behind nature as well. Did a lot of research of indigenous wisdom, and I've learned a lot through that, and really honor that in a lot of our work as well, making sure that we're honoring the local land, the local plants, not just bringing in stuff that is aesthetically pleasing, but benefits future generations as well, and really nourishes our communities, and provides medicine and food and all that stuff. And of course, the community organizing piece of it as well. Like, I think a lot of us have been denied as Americans and around the world that access to nature. And it's so liberating to finally be able to access that, even if it's just a pocket behind a house, like a little garden, even if it's just a little tiny space in a little park. We like just seeing the joy on people's faces when you like walk them through your garden or you go into the woods with them. It's incomparable, like the psychological benefits, that the peace it brings people, seeing resilience happen in real time with other parts of nature, seeing it happen in plants and realize, oh my gosh, like this can happen to me too.
I am so appreciative that you brought that up. And you're reminding me to make a really intentional note here. You know, we're talking about green spaces as this novel and new concept. We also need to acknowledge it's actually not a novel and new concept. Green spaces and healing has been happening in local communities for a long time. It's been happening in Indigenous communities for a long time. It's new to the professionalized movement to end sexual violence, as we often see with health equity stuff and health disparity and anti-oppression. It takes the professional movement quite a bit longer to take it on, and then we treat it like this new thing. You're listening to Prevent Connect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is Prevent Connect. There is this idea that we talked about in our web conference about greening, decolonizing sexual violence prevention. And I think green spaces and gardening is a really great example of that. It's also a great example of the connection between healing and prevention. We often talk about healing after violence as something totally separate from prevention, but they can happen at the same time, and they have been for a long time. We're really just like going for it in this podcast because I'm expecting people to understand the connection between green spaces and healthy communities, the connection to sexual violence, and now in rural areas. So I think if we think about an area like San Francisco or Detroit, where there might not be a lot of green spaces, it can make, it can make sense to be like, okay, yes, more parks equals more community gatherings, but you all are in a very rural area and you already have a lot of green spaces. So why are you taking on this project? How does rural greening differ from what we typically think about when we think about community gardens?
This is a wonderful question. And really, it's the process of connecting our community together and connecting to our agricultural community in the area. So when we think of rural areas, a lot of the times you're seeing farms and you're seeing a whole bunch of plots of land that is being used for food. But most of the times those are going off to, or the food is usually being grown towards major corporations or big chain grocery stores, and it is rare to have that food go locally. So we are trying to participate in at least if we're talking about growing food and food liberation, we are trying to connect with that community. We're trying to give self-liberation to those around us, and also beautification of our rural areas. A lot of our rural areas, we're not backwards, but we still have lack of funding towards our towns. And we also have people on city councils where our funds are not being directed towards the beautification of our places, which can lead to depression, which can lead to violence. It really is a big picture idea here. Like you were saying with these ideas that are being forwarded by the CDC and in this research, it is using these big picture items on with the focus towards preventing violence.
I was thinking about what Andrew was saying about like where our communities are able to put in funding and resources like back into the communities. And I think like one, it's very important. But I think that oftentimes where that focuses is in areas that are already receiving a lot of funding, whereas what we're looking at really making an impact are the areas that people are not feeling safe in. So we're looking at the areas that are less developed, maybe like have like a lot of overgrown grasses, the places that aren't getting the care that they deserve. So all of those kinds of spaces. So what it does is those other spaces are getting the supports already. Wonderful. And we're going to come at this from another angle and add to what is happening in the communities as well.
I love that. And in addition to what you were saying, to funding, we do see funding going towards rural towns, but those towns are usually tourist destinations. And the majority of the country that is rural is not a tourist destination.
It is so interesting that you said that, Andrew. So I currently live in a rural, for people who are not watching the video, I used air quotes, rural area on the central coast of California. It's bougie as heck here. And I'm not saying we don't need resources. We don't need funding. We absolutely do. I grew up in what I would consider a real rural area of California. And so when I came to the Central Coast and started writing grants and saw that we were categorized as rural, I was like, what do you mean? We have a huge university and we're right next to Big Sur and everybody here has wine memberships and everybody's very rich. Like it's a different kind of rural, So like the green spaces where I currently live are probably very different than the green spaces in a lot of areas where Hope Shores is located.
Coming from my experience of living in rural places, we did not have a lot of funding. We were very self-reliant and we had to connect our community through very solid practices. It took a long time for our community to really grow. Not in a sense of population or wealth, but as a culture.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, could you all, maybe before we dive into some of the evidence behind this, and I know, Sarah, you have some of that, why don't you help to paint a picture of what it's like in the area that Hope Shores is located in rural Michigan? What is it like where you're all servicing?
I'd be happy to do that. So firstly, I want to start with saying, and perhaps I'm a little biased because I am a Northeast Lower Michigan farm kid at heart. I did grow up in this area. So we live in one of the most beautiful natural areas surrounded by lakes and forests and rivers. It is an outdoor person's dream. And sometimes we try to keep this a secret so we can contain it to ourselves. But as Andrew already mentioned, we are very dependent on tourism in the area as well. We are on the opposite side of the state from Traverse City, which often when people think of Michigan, that is a northern city people think of, but that is on the opposite coast. So we serve 5 counties in the lower peninsula, which is roughly 5,000 square miles. And our service area is entirely rural. And this means that resources for survivors of violence are really limited, and they are shared among multiple counties. So transportation is very limited. There's not an extensive public transit system. Access to high-speed internet is also very limited, and it comes in and out. Sometimes even in one of the larger cities that we live in, I still have buggy internet here or there. Distances to grocery stores are significant, and these all impact our communities. I would say poverty is a significant barrier in this area. So, for example, one of our counties rates at the 4th highest in terms of the asset limit income constrained employed. That's Montmorency County, which essentially means it's just a framework of understanding the struggles of households that earn above the federal poverty level, but not quite enough to afford the bare bones household budget. And I think one of the biggest determining factors that we can look at in terms of like what poverty looks like and the impacts here are when we look at the rates of students experiencing homelessness, because that is a key indicator of well-being. And 2 of our 5 counties are in the top 5 ratings across the state in terms of numbers of students who are experiencing homelessness. So that's Alcona and Iosco County are both in that. We also have the highest rate of uninsured individuals in the state with really high patient to physician ratio. So access to like primary care and health care is pretty limited as well.
Thank you for painting that picture. I think that that's really helpful. So how does then greening address some of those things that you just talked about, Paige?
So food security wise, farming, locals growing their own food, having those resources is a key component of that. So creating more access than just going to the Dollar Tree, because we have lots of dollar stores in the area that people are very reliant on. And I think those outnumber the number of grocery stores, in fact. But that's not always going to be a source of fresh foods. So having those garden spaces is one way that we can connect people to one another and to those foods in a very practical way. Another way is in terms of how cultivating these spaces in general connects people to their wellness. Sarah and Andrew have both spoken about that. The health benefits to community gardening are absolutely a part of what occurs here. That groundedness, that centeredness, it can help to release stress. Movement for all populations is essential. And so this supports many aspects there. And when we lower stress levels, we're supporting people's overall health as well.
There are 2 things that you mentioned, Paige, and I think Andrew's had spoken about these previously too, that I really want to focus in on. Number 1, the piece on food sovereignty. Andrew, I think we were chatting about this in our prep call, as is the case, I think, in a lot of rural areas. If you're driving through it, you see a lot of food. You see people growing a lot of food. So you assume the community is very rich in food. But the way that our food system works in the United States is it's very rarely for local consumers. A lot of those big growers are shipping elsewhere. So you mentioned a lot of people actually in northern Michigan you're in a food desert. So that is a big piece that community gardens can solve. And then the other piece that I think a lot of people miss when we have this conversation are gardens versus community gardens. I'm really going to focus in on that word community. We know that community connectedness is a huge level of protection against sexual violence and all other interpersonal violence. Paige, I think you and I were chatting prior to this call about this idea of, let's say, a neighborhood, and everybody in the neighborhood has their own personal garden, and they go out and they grow their zucchinis or their tomatoes. And there are good things about that, but they're not connecting with each other. You know, the real level of healing and feeling protected and loved and cared for by your community is when we interact with each other. So that's where community gardening comes in. That's where trading and giving food comes in. It's about building those relationships. And Sarah, I know from the coalition level, there is quite a bit of growing evidence that supports that idea. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, there is a lot of research that comes out of the crime prevention through environmental design. And they talk a lot about the health, the physical, psychological benefits of being close to nature, and those natural spaces as protective factors. And often, honestly, this stuff isn't really well researched. A lot of people are like, well, show me the paper, show me the research. And it's like, well, go outside, grow your own food. Like when you step into those spaces, you feel it yourself and you know that it's probably reflecting within others as well. I think Andrew had mentioned earlier that sort of empowerment. I mean, having responsibility for another life, that stewardship, really builds like self-efficacy. Like, oh, if I can take care of this plant, like I can take care of myself. And if I can give a handful of tomatoes to my neighbor, maybe next year or next week, they'll give me a bushel of corn or something, And I think when we look towards community, it's no longer about scarcity and competition, but it's really about abundance, abundance in friendship, in sharing, laughter versus like, worrying, is my next paycheck going to be able to help me afford what I need to buy? And it is definitely unique in Michigan as well because we have such long winters here.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And, we do get a lot of questions about research and evidence behind this. And I think number one, there are things out there people have to look. And number two, we're like, well, you get to be a part of that evidence. Like there are some things, especially when we're talking about decolonizing our work, we have to be willing to do things that have not necessarily become evidence-based yet. I'm a personal fan of evidence-informed and being a part of that evidence. When we talk about grassroots movements to end violence, for community healing, they're not basing it off of studies and trials and research paper and peer-reviewed journals. They're basing it off of how people feel in the community. Obviously, it's a little bit different when we're getting funding from federal structures, but we have to kind of be able to walk that line.
Yeah, in my research in food sovereignty, a lot of the times you see the word food desert pop up, right? It's really an intentional withholding of food and resources, right? They don't have to build a Dollar Tree on every block. And also, a lot of times we don't recognize, in Detroit, for example, like you can probably call a neighborhood a food desert, right? I'm using air quotes for those listening, when really there have been generations of people gardening in their neighborhoods, for forever and providing food for their neighbors. And I think that we forget that when we look at the research and look at the numbers and break it down. It's harder for someone in academia to look up on Facebook who's chatting with who and who's exchanging food, right? Or going out in the neighborhood, maybe doing an anthropological study.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's what's amazing about this conversation right now. Sarah, you're coming from kind of the more academia perspective. Paige and Andrew, you are those people in communities connecting with other people. Like that is what is happening. So we've kind of painted the picture. I want to transition there. I want to talk about the actual work that you're doing, the things that you're outputting, as much as I would love to just pick your brain and share knowledge for this entire conversation. So you all are still very early in the stages of this work and building that evidence. Andrew, you're really the person on the ground building this project out. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, fantastic question. So right now we are definitely still in the planning stage, the research stage. We are collaborating with the coalition heavily on this mutual aid design. The community garden, we're really just looking at how the community, how we need to address the community's needs, right? We were talking about how, like, we're having Family Dollars and dollar stores pop up everywhere all around town. And the reason we're seeing this from developers and we're not having personal development in our communities is one, of course, economic disparity. We aren't able to connect as a community since we're also on online spaces so much to really pull together money to build gardens or to build mutual aid stores for these places. So really, we're just addressing the needs of our community, and we're looking at ways to empower not only the current residents of our towns, but future generations.
Thank you for sharing. And it sounds like I know you're all working on a few different things in your community. Mm-hmm. One of those things is a community garden that you all are in the process of sketching. Mm-hmm. That's a community garden at one of your service sites, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. This is actually at the office I work out of. We have 2 offices, or 3 offices currently. In one of our southern counties, Iosco County, we have a very big backyard, and we didn't really have much to do with it. And, I mean, you think, well, what's the point of building a garden in a backyard where people are not really going to see it? Well, this is our outreach office for our southern counties. This is where survivors come in and they come and seek services. They work with our advocates for medical, legal, and additional services. And this is just another section. We are here to come and add to that self-empowerment for those going through the motions of self-advocacy.
Yeah, and it's been really exciting. Like, as soon as I heard I could have the opportunity to like jump on designing a garden, I did. And I've done some like permaculture courses before, which is sometimes controversial. It really is just indigenous techniques of growing with the land. But using those natural structures like spirals, using just the native plants and a lot of herbs that you would think like that actually can like help with depression, with anxiety, with like blood pressure, and foods that people can learn how to pickle with or make sauces with, or, even sell like at the local farmers market. And it's been really fun working with Andrew. Like, he has such a creative mind. And we have just talked a lot about their future engagement ideas, community engagement ideas, like selling seeds, sharing seeds with one another, getting involved with those who know how to forage, and like teaching classes in this space for survivors and people who may not be survivors. Maybe their family members can come in and just, decompress, learn, and have a private space to access that little bit of that pocket of nature.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for adding that. I really liked that piece on focusing on native plants, right? Because if you look around the country today, a lot of our, for example, grasses and our current plants that we see all over the country is a lot of European and foreign grasses. And a lot of the native permaculture and the plants, they are very sparse and few and far between. If you look at Illinois, for example, the Prairie State, as what it's called, the Prairie State has maybe about 50 acres left of prairie these days, as opposed to thousands of acres back in the 50s. So we really want to just push the culture towards, like you said, Janae, decolonization of not only the land, the culture, and working with prevention work.
That's really powerful. And you all actually want this garden to be survivor-led. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So it is a focus of equity, right? This is furthering that idea of equity in our communities. And if we can have those who can really use this outsource, they can also speak on behalf of possibly bringing this elsewhere, bringing the culture of food to other community members. So those who may not be seeking our services will have their own outlets as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. And, like earlier we were mentioning how this knowledge of nature, of plants, of food is intentionally kept from us, and how empowering it is to be able to learn about these things. And it's like really exciting as well. Anytime I've like brought someone to look at my garden, like I'll explain a few things like, how do you know all that? And I'm like, well, YouTube and like TikTok and talking to people and reading books. But what a gift it is for people to share that knowledge with you. And it's so empowering to be able to be like, I know how to plant this. I know when to harvest it. I know the properties of this plant, how it's going to help me feel better. And I can give this, St. John's wort to my friend because she's feeling down. And, and it's just that stewardship of land and for their community is just such a healing tool for folks.
For a lot of the survivors we work with, many of them are fleeing their homes, and many of them had gardens. And I see this as one of those tools that they may choose to really step foot into and reconnect and hopefully teach us as well, as what we're learning from a variety of other resources and such. But I see them like choosing how to grow it, and if they're going to take items to farmers markets, and how they're going to develop their own business plans and move forward. And maybe they have like crafting skills and such, and they're going to, in the winter farmers markets, have different booths set up. So I just really see it intersecting so much with the intervention work as well as the prevention side of things, in that sense. So really giving survivors the space and supporting them in that.
I think when most people think about community gardens, they only think about the actual space. And so it can feel quite a bit smaller than it actually is. A few veggies and plants in a backyard is one thing, but so much community and connection and healing, like you all said, happens around gardens, from the food to the actual garden itself. Some of the most powerful healing moments that I have had have been in community gatherings at gardens. Something about being in a community garden disarms you. And it makes, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. I had a recent experience in a community garden. A friend of mine she's a practicing Mennonite and invited me to a church service in her hometown. And I am someone, being queer and growing up really religious, I was kind of like, I don't know. But I think that stewardship over the land and this care for each other, care for community, like being in that space made me feel a lot more connected. It created more pathways for healing. It was just a different feeling than walking into a brick and mortar place. It felt quite literally like there was physical decolonization happening. And for anyone who is kind of unsure about what that feels like, I would encourage you to move your meeting space from a brick and mortar space to a community garden and tell me what happens. Or if you're meeting with a friend and you're going out to get a drink, maybe offer let's walk to our community garden instead and tell me what feels different in your body, because I guarantee that something will. I'm curious for you all, since you are in the earlier phases of this, what do you hope will come out of this garden? What are some of your dreams?
What we really look forward to is connecting with the audiences we don't usually get to connect with. Because oftentimes in this work, we are a little bit out of bounds for those who are maybe in their own world. Maybe they have their own house and they aren't aware of all of these problems that a lot of our population faces. And when we do give services to those people, they don't necessarily, they don't see it because they're not there. And I think by connecting to our agricultural community and in a more relatable way for our rural area, I think we would be able to connect to those populations. And that is one of my hopes, is connecting community in a place that is maybe more xenophobic towards outsiders, towards those that they don't see as part of the inn.
Mm-hmm. You know, Andrew, I love that you mentioned that. Talking about connection, a big conversation that we have in the sexual violence space is how to bring people together with different perspectives. That a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about sexual violence, or they have different ideas politically. And, you know, my personal perspective, there are two things that I think bring people in from all sides. We'll say three things that bring people together from all sides of the political spectrum: food, sports, and pets. And I think if you can tap into any of those things, you're really starting in the right place.
I think when it comes down to it, I think there could be so many directions in which it grows, but like my big hopes, my dreams for this garden are that they create more space for love, more space for connection, and friendships.
Yeah, seconding everything they both said. I think, and just love for nature, love for food, feeling like there is something in their life they can have a little bit of control of. You know, as survivors, our lives can be pretty chaotic. And having a place that they can go to at Hope Shores, even if it's just like a little backyard or a meeting or a day they just go to like the market and share seeds. I just hope that stays with them and that they spread that knowledge to other people. I know that all these survivors that come, they'll definitely spread this love and knowledge as well. So
I think that's a really inspiring and powerful piece to kind of bring this conversation to a close. Thank you so much, Paige, Andrew, Sarah, for having this conversation with me. I feel quite a bit more grounded than I did when I started, and I am so appreciative of your work and really excited to see where this goes. For people who are listening and are feeling super stoked and want to see what happens, how can people follow along and connect with you?
Absolutely. So we are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and of course our website is www.hopeshores.org.
And if you have questions about this episode, you can go to Spotify. They have a Q&A feature. You can leave us questions there. You can also comment on our corresponding posts on same thing, Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, you name it. We're there. We're on Threads. If you're on there, I think me and 3 other people are on Threads. Find us and interact with this episode. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you all.
Thank you, Janae, for this space. This has been great.
Beyond their garden sketch, Hope Shores is working on a community labyrinth that will incorporate native plant species, stone, and other natural resources to shape a winding pathway for reflection and mindfulness. Their hope is to support creativity, self-reflection, and stress reduction in creating spaces for survivors and the larger community. They're currently in the process of hotspot mapping to find an accessible space in the community for the labyrinth to live. You can learn more about greening as a strategy to prevent and end sexual violence in our 2 latest web conference recordings, Greening and Growing Parts 1 and 2, created in partnership with Prevention Institute and featuring leaders across the spaces of violence prevention and public health. If you enjoyed this podcast, check out other Valor Media podcasts, Leadership Moves, and Valor Conversations. And make sure you rate us and write us a review on Spotify and Apple Music so we can reach more listeners like you. Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control. You can find more information about this episode along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.